talked about some of these numbers this morning, and Lorraine, I'm going to start with you, but we've been looking at numbers like women are 20% of board members across the Russell 3000. The Women CEOs in America report, which we released, Women Business Collaborative, on September 22nd. We do that in collaboration with the SEND Committee of 200 and Catalysts. So that's women are 8.8% of CEOs in the Fortune 500. So this is the data piece of this, right? Lorraine, why don't you start? What's happening? What does this look like?
Well, there's good news and there's not so good news. The good news is that we're at the highest we've ever been, a number of CEOs in the Fortune 500 at 8.8%, and that's not quite as good at the S&P and the Russell 3000, but it's still higher than it's ever been. Secondly, on boards, as you all know, we're getting close to 30% of women on boards. It's tremendous, and in terms of women of color, we've had a banner couple of years. So the reality is there's a lot more focus on all this. I'm very excited about the board number because that means when we have women in power, they will influence women across the whole chain. They'll be in place to make that progress, and that happened because of intentionality, the focus from George Floyd, the focus on all this. This is something that the companies were able to fish in a broader pond, and they were able to make some really great progress. As it relates to women CEOs and the pipeline, that takes a lot more work. That takes all the work that many of us are involved in, having commitment at the top, putting the right policies and practices, have the measurement and accountability, and then building those inclusive cultures that help advance and deal with bias, supportership, all the things that we work on. So, we are not where we wanted to be. When we set our goals up, we were hoping to be like at 15% women CEOs in the Fortune 500 by 2025. I think it's going to be more like 10 or 12, but it's steady progress. When I was in the workplace, started in the workplace, there was only Martha Graham in the workplace in the Fortune 500. In 2020, we were at 7, now we're at 44. So we're making progress, but it's too slow. So we need to really drive intentionality.
Before we get to that, I want to talk about another piece of the data which we don't talk about often enough, which is private companies, right? And we do this together in this report.
Right. It was important for us to include private companies because there's a lot of women CEOs. But when you think about it, there's a little over 12 million women-owned businesses, which sounds like a lot, but it's really not. It's only 8% of privately held companies. 8% is nothing. So we have to get more capital to those women to start businesses. We did do a lot of growth in this area from 20 to 21, almost 50% more than we normally do in women entrepreneurs. But it's still, we need more women out there. We have a lot of women CEOs. Like I said, it's only about 8%. But what we see them starting these new businesses. And, it's important for us in this report to highlight them. So we highlighted women that were doing over $500 million. That's a huge number, and we really had some nice women in the report and able to highlight them and found a lot of them, so it was great.
It was really interesting. It's good to look at their backgrounds and pathways. And before we jump to this intentionality, Gail and I were talking kind of before we came in the room about, that commitment. And Lorraine, you brought it up, the sort of board chair CEO. We seem to be doing a little bit better on women on boards. The numbers are a little bit higher. Gail, you and I know why. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I shared that it should not be surprising to anyone that there are more women on boards than there are women CEOs. I mean, it's a simple math equation, right? Just take your Fortune 500 companies or your Fortune 1000 companies. That means that's what? 1,000 CEOs. But those same Fortune 1000 companies have multiple board seats. So it's not surprising that you have more women on boards than you have women CEOs. But I loved what my sister Lorraine just said. Great news is we've made progress, but let's not think of progress as, yay, we're finished, we're complete, we're there. We have many miles to go before we sleep. We have a lot more work to do. So I think that's what we need to focus on is, yes, pause, clap for the accomplishments, but never lose sight of the fact that we have a long, long way to go.
So I can't decide it. Let's pick up on that. Sort of what do we need to start doing, right? Usually we end all these panels with what's the call to action, but Lorraine, you brought it up, and you brought it up, Gail, right now. What do we need to do? We talked this morning, excuse me, about intentionality from the CEO. what do we need to do to build that? And Kimber, I'm going to start with you because we did the C-suite paper. So what do we need to start doing to make sure that we're living that commitment every day?
Well, there's a lot of things we need to do, right? So the first thing is transparency. So I think we've talked a lot about that today. Transparency is important. Where one of the things I want to add on what Gail said is where we do have a woman CEO, we see a much better chance of women being on the board also. So they will develop their advisory board, their board of women, and especially women of color. So that's so important. But when we did our pipeline paper, one of the things that was really, really important, and I think Sandra Quince mentioned it earlier, is that it's sponsorship. It's really putting women forward. It's women putting women forward. It's men putting women forward. It's really focusing on how we get that to happen. And, I really even say it starts really early on. So when we look at that pipeline, we focus a lot on, the C-suite pipeline and from that manager level up, but it's even lower than that. Right, it's every level in a company that we need to look at. And we need to say, where are those women? Where are those women of color? And how are we going to elevate them and get them into those manager roles, then the C-suite roles? Because it takes time, right? It takes a lot of time.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, there's a litany of things that need to be done. But regarding the sponsorship, it's particularly important for women of color who aren't necessarily in those networks, that don't have those automatic sponsors and mentors. And particularly we sponsor them into the line jobs that they need to have so they can compete for the CEO jobs. The other thing I want to mention is the importance of allyship and getting men involved. So, Catalyst has a program called MARC, Men Advocating Real Change, and it does at every level, helps men understand, especially white men, their privilege and get them emotionally connected to really being allies for women and to underrepresented groups so that they can do the things on the day-to-day basis, sponsor them, interrupt bias, don't create a culture of silence, so there's so many things that we need to get the men involved.
And I think, again, looking at, what has made the men successful. It's not osmosis, right? You just don't wake up one day and become a CEO. I don't care if you're a male or female, white or a person of color. There is a path to the CEO suites. And so to the point that was made earlier, very early in your career, are those allies, those sponsors, and those mentors tapping you and saying, let's do a P&L job, let's do a line job, let's do a job where you have a large scope of responsibility, where you have a large group of team that you are responsible for managing, where you have a budget, and you have, responsibility for multiple locations, maybe in and outside of the United States. When you have that bench of CEO eligible women who have checked all the boxes of what it takes to be a CEO, they will start rising to the top. But what happens is late in some careers, women realize that they don't have all the requisite boxes checked because a mentor, an ally, or a sponsor did not say to them, did not guide them in the direction that would have made them CEO eligible. So being very intentional about that path, which is known, it's not a secret. The path, it's very clear what it takes to become a CEO. Ensuring that those boxes are checked will get more women to the CEO spot.
When I want to you're going to pick up on that, aren't you?
I was just going to add something in there because one of the things that I'm an advocate for, especially for C200, is network. For us to build our network. And, when you go to a guy and say, hey, we have a CEO position, do you know anybody? The first thing they'll say is, I know a guy.
Yep.
I know a guy. They know right away. And no one really even questions whether that guy can do the job or not. If you go to a woman, or they don't even go to a woman, if they go to a man and say, do you know a woman, they have to think, well, I don't really know one. And I don't know if they're qualified. We have to put out a search for one. We have to look for one. So that's the key is those networks we really have to build, and we have to build early on. And I think that's why WBC, one of the reasons why we're all here, is also because of that. But I think that it's so important to really build your network and build it early on. And I can't even say to even younger women, do that from the very beginning. We have a question.
I just have a comment because my best My best friend was the highest paid woman in America, or the ninth highest paid, in 2009. When she retired 5 or 6 years ago, I said to her, Sharon, why didn't you ever throw your hat into the ring to be a CEO? And she looked at me and she said, Laura, I never thought of it. So what she has done is created a nonprofit, ABC to CEO.com. And I invite all of you to look at it because it's teaching young women how to prepare and think about becoming a CEO. I just invite you to take a look at it, and if you believe it's something valuable, donate.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because there are no accidental CEOs. There are none, zero. I dare you to show me one accidental CEO. There was a path. There was a path. There was someone who tapped that person very early in their career and said, let's put you on the path. And they had the ABCs to the CEO suite. But we are hidden in plain sight. There are plenty of women who are eligible to be or can be eligible to become CEOs. We just have to put them on the path.
Can I? Hidden in plain
Hidden in plain, love it.
Go ahead.
I'm on a public board, and I wanted to have more diversity on the board. So I went to the CEO, and they're like, well, we don't know anyone. I'm like,
But
well,
they're
then we
telling
can
the
fish
truth.
in a bigger pool here.
Yeah.
So I volunteered to do the search, and we had like 50 qualified candidates for this very specific search, all diverse candidates. It just took a little intentionality and a little work to fish it up in the ocean, not in the pond. And people are not comfortable with doing that, but if they do the work, they are all. This is why it always amazes me. All these women tell me I can't get on boards, and then all the board people say I can't find women.
What is going on? Well, I want to pick up on that intentionality piece too, because it rests on all four of us, and it brings in the allyship, right? It matters where you build your network.
Absolutely.
Gail, right? You cannot build your network in an echo chamber, right? And you might want to talk a little bit. We were just talking about that.
Yeah, I think, as a woman and as a person of color, I have to even check my own biases, right? And part of that bias is even checking my own network to say, if it is an intent for me to be on a board, and it was my intention, and I am also on what I hope is going to be the first of many corporate boards, I had to look at my network and where I spent my time and who I spent my time with. And I found that my own bias is that I spent my time with a lot of Gail Marie Coles Johnson, African American women, college educated, who in the same groups the social groups that I was in. And so I had to widen my own network. And so it is a thing of, yes, we need sponsorships, we need mentors, but we also need to reach out and be more intentional about where we're spending our time, who are we spending our time with, how are we cultivating our networks and being more inclusive of not necessarily people that we've always been around for most of our lives. The board that I'm on, and I just shared this with Gwen, not only am I the only African American, not only am I the only woman, I'm the only person that went to a public college. I did not go to an Ivy League school. So how many of us intentionally, if you went to a public university, are making your way to find friends and allies and acquaintances who went to Ivy League colleges? That's a whole network of people that you may not have a line of sight to. And to your point, they don't know you.
That's great. It's exactly that. And men traditionally have social networks that women never have.
That's right.
So golfing, those kinds of things. That's why it's so important for women to find those and seek them out.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to switch us back a little bit to the company or the organization, right? And when we did the C-suite paper, we interviewed people and we talked about it, and we've all mentioned, P&L responsibility. There was a list that you could tick. COVID hits, technology hits, pathways are different. There's new corporate tech positions. We talked about this earlier. What do organizations, Lorraine, I'm going to start with you, and companies can do to make sure that they're intentionally looking outside, that they're fishing in the ocean and not in the pond? And what can they do to that pathway to the C-suite? Because it must look very different than it did 50 years ago.
Well, I think the roles, I'm going to get into, I think what's needed for leadership in the post-COVID world is evolving. And we are looking at a more humane leadership style. Human capital is becoming so important. And Penny had said something at your conference I thought was great, is that there was a war for talent and talent won. So the role of the CHRO is so much more important. In fact, they were saying CHROs are in hot demand for board seats now. So, the research that we're doing says you need more empathetic leadership. You need a leadership that's not performative around these social issues, who understands where people are coming from and connect to what their needs are. Everyone, the millennials and Gen Z, are all purpose-driven. They're all looking for meaning and purpose in their lives. So I'm hopeful, actually, that what we traditionally consider feminine or soft skills in leadership are the ones that are going to make a difference, and that we can broaden the aperture of what leadership looks like in the 21st century, and that many women who maybe were socialized or have had to, they project that empathy, will become the leaders of the 21st century. So, I think when people look at what the skills that they want, not only for the CEO job or the board job, but for different levels in the company, they prioritize those leadership skills more highly.
And I would actually think about it in the context of ESG. So yes, the social piece, the S piece, but also environmental and governance. It was thrilling to me that WBC had a partnership that is now allowing women to become cybersecurity certified. And so understanding cybersecurity, not to the point where you're able to track down a hacker, but that you're conversant about cybersecurity risk, is a huge asset to be able to bring that skill to a board or to your company to say, I am conversant on this topic. So thinking about and looking up, and again, there's a lot of great publications around ESG, looking at those skills that are listed under environmental, social, or governance, and thinking about how many of those do I have, or how many of those can I acquire, I think is a great thing to, a great way to build skill post-COVID.
I just want to add to that is I think that we're going through this major digital transformation, and especially a lot of the frontline jobs are changing. So I also think an upskilling and reskilling, especially around digital literacy, and companies really leaning into helping particularly women and underrepresented groups really get those skills and make that transition is a real opportunity.
Absolutely.
And skills-based, looking at skills-based rather than credentials.
Right, and I was going to add in there, you said digital literacy, financial literacy. We have so many, only one or two people in the company, in most corporate companies, have access to a real P&L, and that's something that should be shared. It should be educated amongst the entire leadership team, amongst the managers, because if you want to get that CEO job, you need to know that. And the first thing that we'll say is, well, you don't know how to run a P&L. And so they should make sure that that their leadership team, their executive team, those people in the pipeline know how to do it. They shouldn't have one person doing it, one or two people. They should have 10 people that know how to do it in the company and teach them, and so they can excel and become those CEOs.
But being that continuous learner that's not, resting on our laurels to say, like, I'm not the CFO, I'm the CHRO, which I am, so I don't really care about the finances, and tuning out, which I don't do. We have to be intentional also about developing ourselves. And so becoming conversant in the financials, even if you're not the CFO. I do, as a CHRO, take time to spend time with our CFO and have conversations around, help me through this sheet. You gave us these financial reports. What are the things that I should pay attention to? People are happy to help you when you ask for help. CFOs love to explain the numbers. Nobody ever talks to them. Take your CFO out to lunch. He or she will be thrilled. They're used to people's eyes glazing over, or people picking up their phone when they start going through their report. So you leaning in, showing that you're interested and really want to understand the financials is helping you, and they are more than willing to share.
Well, Khalil and I were talking about that this morning in Akamai. It's having the same language. It's all part of the business, and so it's using the same language and not being off to the side. We've talked over a little bit, and I just want to kind of pick up on the sort of last thing on this thread, women of color. How do we do this for all women, right? And I am looking at you, Gail, but for a variety of reasons, right? From where you sit to this conversation is, how do we make sure from allyship to we talk in the WBC about everyone having access to the same information, the same P&L responsibility, opportunities for mentorship and sponsorship. What tricks? What can we do to make sure that we're bringing along all women?
And Gwen has turned into my new BFF. She just doesn't know it yet. But but we had this amazing conversation, and Edie, who has known me my entire life, she literally met me when I was a baby, and when I was with AT&T. It starts with this. It starts with this conversation and understanding that yes, even as we are making strides with women of color are lagging and black women are lagging. But do we care? Are we being intentional about that conversation? Just recently, I think it was, and I'm going to misquote this, Equity Day. I believe it was in the month of September, we celebrated Black Women Equity Day. And it wasn't a celebration, it was a recognition that it takes women until March, I think it is, March, April, to get to the same pay that a man would get to. And it takes until September for a black woman to get to equal pay of men. So isn't that amazing? Women would have to work until March, April. Black women would have to work until September, October to get the same pay as their white male counterpart. So do we know that? Do we care about that? Are we talking about that? Are we looking at that? When every hiring decision results in, a non-diverse workforce, are we stepping back and saying, wait, individually, everybody can justify why they made the hiring decision that they've made, but collectively, we are not representative of the people that buys our products and services, that we support, that we serve, nor are we where we want to be. So what do we need to do differently? And being very intentional about that. But that starts with a conversation. It starts with recognition and owning it, and then doing something about it.
Feel like they belong. They could be. Add another thing. We all talk about inclusive cultures as being places where people feel like they belong. They can be more productive. They can be. They have. They stay longer. They are more innovative. But there's an emotional tax for people of color in the workplace, which means that they have to do more to present themselves in the culture. This affects their retention, their mental health, and there's an awareness that people have to have around what this tax is on women of color, and be really aware of it, and then be empathetic and understanding of that so that they can really feel like they belong.
And I really want to touch base on the purpose of that, meaning that the younger generations are, voting as consumers with their wallets. They're saying, I won't buy from that company. I won't work there. And that's what it's going to take. And it's going to take us, too, to really say, I'm not going to do business with those companies. I'm not going to buy from them. And more, that's the only way I think these companies will really start to make a difference.
No, you're exactly right.
So I think you're absolutely, it's a whole new. So we've talked about a lot. I'm going to throw these guys a question that they're not prepared for as your last question, right? So we've talked about the board. We've talked about the CEO. We've talked about the C-suite, the link. We talked before this panel, you start from the beginning, whether that's negotiating your pay to building your networks. So 2025, where are we going to make the most progress? The board, CEOs, or the C-suite?
So Gail is an and person. The boards, the C-suites, and I am very, very passionate about this. I think that sometimes we settle, right? We want it all. We can have it all. We don't have to choose between whether we want C-suites to see advancement in C-suite seats or on boards or on frontline jobs, as Lorraine and I talked about. We can make traction and have improvement and in progress in every last one of those areas. Why should we settle for one?
I'm in agreement. That's a hard act to follow because that's exactly it. Why should we settle? I mean, and 2025 is not that far away, right? We can do it. And years to come. But I think that, we set those goals for 2025. I think we ask all these corporations to continue with those, with the transparency and the purpose and making sure that it happens.
There you go.
Hold them accountable.
So I'm the pragmatist in the room, and I'll give you my perspective. So, it is easier to make change at the board because if you fish in the broader pond, you can do this. This is why we see real progress. You know, all those black women who are out there that are board qualified, they finally found them. You know, just took some work. Same thing with pay equity. You know, if you want to go do an audit and you want to systematically pay equal pay for equal work, you can make it happen. But if you want to promote women into leadership roles, you've got to change your culture, you've got to measure, you've got to be accountable, you've got to give them those line jobs, and it takes a few years. We're making reality. So I will say, and you've seen it already in the last few years, we're making more rapid rate of progress in the board level, more rapid rate of progress on equal pay for equal work. It's more difficult to get the representation up through those different levels, and it takes a lot of work. So that's my answer.
Start with the board. So I want to thank you all. We could continue for another hour probably.
Could.
Thank you for the work of you. Thank you for the work of ELC, Catalyst, and Committee of 200. And everyone, please look at the 2025 and 2030 targets. You can hold us accountable.
Thank you.